We're this afternoon gathered for the final session of this New Century group. There may be another edition coming later, but a special event. But I'll talk about that later after we've finished. So it's the final session. It's the section that deals with love as well as good and evil in the Toynbee Acada dialogue from pages 304 through to the end at 339. And as usual, to discuss with us the concepts that Sensei and Dr. Toynbee explain is the General Director of NSUK, Mr. Richard Kristen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is the final act of Sensei to Shakubuku Dr. Toynbee. And although, of course, none of us know whether Dr. Toynbee ever chanted, probably he didn't. He was a very old man by this time. But as I think I told you right at the beginning in one of the lectures, he spent the last year of his life totally paralyzed. But his secretary, who'd been with him for many years, told me that although he was paralyzed, the most impressive thing about his life for that year was the brightness of his eyes. And she really felt that he was still working in his mind, even though he wasn't able to do anything physically. So who knows what thoughts he came to during that last year. So this last part is Sensei's final thrust to Shakubuku him, and Toynbee agrees. They're in the book ends with them being in total agreement. The only one point, you remember, which they couldn't actually agree on was forgotten the word, euthanasia. But apart from euthanasia, Toynbee totally agreed. So this section of the book really carries a message which is of great hope, don't you think, for the future. The fact that this man, a scholar of great renown, could respond and agree. And Sensei shows his deep gratitude by letting him have the last word. So Toynbee's honesty and his lack of any sort of scholarly egoism really stands out throughout this book. And also the openness of his mind. And despite his age, the fact that he was still seeking the truth. So you're all very young, but Toynbee is a great lesson for me. But he can also be a lesson for you when you get to my age. Incredible man, I feel. So this book has been published in many, many languages already. I think 14 different languages. But the sad thing is that it's never been properly published in this country, as I said, I think, in the very first lecture. So I'm determined, and I hope you'll be determined too, that somehow or other, it'll be through Daimoku, we've got to wrest the copyright of this book from the Oxford University Press, who can't understand its importance, and get it published somewhere, somehow, by a company who are well known and who are able to handle its marketing and distribution in this country. I'm sure it's going to happen, but I feel New Century Group's Daimoku is particularly important because it's bound to come from a deeper level than probably many other members even. So let's just be determined that somehow or other in the next, I feel, 5 years, we've got to achieve the publication of this book all over again. Because it hasn't dated a bit, has it? Although it was written 12 years ago. So Sensei moves on to talk about, in the first part of this particular section, the fact that good and evil are inherent in life. This is such a common understanding for us that we can very easily forget after we've practiced for 5 or 6 years, say. that in many other religions, this point isn't clear. So Buddhism is crystal clear that both good and evil exist. Man wasn't born all good, nor was he born all bad. So the theory of Christianity is that due to his naughtiness in the Garden of Eden, man became all bad. But that's ridiculous. In fact, both good and evil exist side by side, and the whole struggle of life is between that negativity and positivity. So Sensei is very anxious that Toynbee should get that particular point straight. And he wasn't clear about it in the earlier parts of the book. That in other words, and he does that by talking about the 10 worlds. So although he may not go into it in great detail, the 10 worlds are the best way to understand that, because each of the 10 worlds, of course, has, therefore, both negative and positive in it. The 10th world of Buddhahood, in a sense, has negative if it's not working at all. Of course, when Buddhahood is working, it's all positive. And of course, I'm sure you understand that the whole function of Buddhahood is to keep all these other 9 worlds working positively. So Buddhism is denying nothing in that sense, just the same as Buddhism doesn't deny that there is evil as well as good in the human being. Buddhism then points out that in the very function of life, evil can be turned into good in every possible state of life that exists, provided you've got the key to do it. That's the point, isn't it? So it would be worthwhile just reviewing those 10 worlds and how negative and positive manifests itself in each one. As long as we're all clear that the function of Buddhahood itself is to draw the other 9 worlds through it, and in the process turn like a filter, turn each of those 9 worlds to its positive aspect, unfailingly. So often we go through a day without any probably great experience of Buddhahood. Even though we've done a great Gongyo in the morning, we do a great Gongyo in the evening. But we couldn't say possibly that there was some obvious experience, like a flash of great wisdom or an incredible feeling of compassion for someone. We couldn't say probably in many days that Buddhahood was working in us. Perhaps it's one of the reasons why we find it so hard to believe that Buddhahood is in us. But the fact is that the more we practice, the more we realize that in every mood and state of life that we're in, somehow or other, it's producing its most positive side. And sometimes it may be in the midst of a sea of negative circumstances around us. And what is happening to us in those negative circumstances makes us feel that perhaps for a moment in the pit of despair. But the fact is that if you're chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo because you're turning each word all the time from its negative into its positive aspect, you find you pull yourself out of that negative set of circumstances that surround you. And looking back on it, you think, my goodness, that was a great experience. I got something from that in every way. So this is Buddhahood at work. Buddhahood which works in one's daily life and in often a very camouflaged way. We don't realize it until we realize more and more that everything that happens to us has positive value. It may take us 5 or 6 or 7 years of practice to realize that. It may take some people 10 or 15. But this is the amazing thing about Buddhahood, that Buddhahood is nothing extraordinary. That's the very words Nichiren Daishonin used in the Gosha. Buddhahood is nothing extraordinary. So going back to those 10 worlds, I'm sure most of you know it, but we just review those negative and positive aspects. So hell, which can be such a miserable world to be in, has its positive aspects, which is that without hell, you couldn't know what happiness was. In other words, it's the contrast between hell and the other worlds, which is a driving force for us to keep out of that lowest state of life. We don't want to be in hell. Therefore, it drives us forward to try to establish a better state of life. So even hell has its positive aspect. And then hunger, which can be a most distressing world to be trapped in its negative side, where you're always longing for something, and when you get it, you start yearning for something else. And I mean, it's not just a longing or a yearning, but it's an aching, gnawing pain. On the other hand, hunger, when it's working for peace, is great. A person who is hungry for justice or for peace, or hungry for learning, for that matter, this is working in its positive way. Then animality. Animality is so important. Animality is the instinct to sleep when you should sleep, to eat when you should eat. Animality is responsible for making one do things to keep healthy or to avoid getting injured or ill. In other words, spontaneous, instantaneous actions. Animality is the world in which a mother instinctively watches over her child and makes sure that it doesn't get into too dangerous a situation. On the other hand, animality in its negative side, of course, is quite horrible, isn't it? The world of domination, dominating the weak and buttering up and flattering and cowering before someone who you feel is stronger than you. Then anger, well, that's an example that's often used because anger in its positive side is passion. Passion for peace. So that's a vitally important aspect of one's life, to have passion, isn't it? Driving you on. So someone, who was at the Leaders' Assembly last month? You remember I thumped the table a few times. But I wasn't angry. Someone said, "Oh, you were so angry, Mr. Corson." I wasn't angry. But I was certainly passionate. There's a great difference, isn't there? Tranquility. Tranquility can be a dangerous world because you can just lose touch with the world in general. You can become stagnant. That over-desiring tranquility means a stagnant and life which is not really creating value, not advancing anywhere. But on the positive side, of course, a little tranquility is very important. It's a time, if you like, of rest and refreshment, and a time when you can generate the energy to take action again. But if you stay there beyond the boundary line, you can just become a lazily, useless sort of vegetable. Rapture. Rapture is a heady world. It's very joyful. Its other name is heaven. And you enter rapture when your desires have been satisfied in some way. But rapture, as we all know, can lead very quickly to hell. In other words, in the world of rapture, you don't look where you're going. You don't take note of what's going on around you. You think the world is yours. And so caught up in this rapturous state that, of course, as you all, especially as young women, as you all know, rapture can so easily lead you to drop into the pit of hell through some happening or other, because you're not looking where you're going. So overjoyed are you with the satisfaction of some desire. And then, of course, we go to the higher worlds, which also have both a negative and positive side, even though they're called higher worlds. I think you all know them. The world of learning is so important, obviously, yet it's also the world of the conceited mind. People who become self-satisfied with their learning and believe themselves to be superior to other people and put themselves on a pedestal, usually quite erroneously. And partial enlightenment, again, this arises from a seeking mind, doesn't it? But again, it can very easily become a state of isolation. Absorption is another word for that world, partial enlightenment. A person who becomes absorbed with his or her particular thing that they're challenging in order to understand it. That is very good. But at the same time, they can become isolated. We all know stories of professors who become absent-minded, lose all their friends, or other people who get absorbed so much that if anyone interrupts them with whatever particular thing they're working on, they turn on them in anger and so on. And many painters, of course, have died in a state of utter loneliness, painters, composers, because of their absorption. Because in their absorption, they didn't pay attention, perhaps even to their well-being, and became sick and ill through not eating properly. There are all sorts of ways in which the negative aspect of absorption can work. And then there's bodhisattva, devotion to the task of relieving others of their sufferings. And one would have thought that that could have no negative aspect to it. But in fact, as I know I mentioned before in one of the lectures, it does have a negative aspect. Because it's very easy when you're helping others to feel that you're superior to them in the most subtle of ways. That you feel you're sacrificing yourself for the sake of those people. You may have great concern for those people, but at the same time, actually, you're looking upon them as that little bit lower than yourself. This is the problem of charity. Often, charity involves that aspect of self-sacrifice and looking down on those who you are helping. So, of course, not looking down in a dominating way necessarily or in an angry way, but looking upon them as something inferior. I've given up my all so that I can look after these people. So very easily it can turn into that dangerous aspect of superiority over those that you're helping, isn't it? However, of course, on its positive side, bodhisattva is incredible. A devotion to drawing away the sufferings of others. So returning to what I said at the beginning, I hope it's clear that if you chant Nam-myoho Renge Kyo without you even realizing it, you will be turning all those 9 other worlds into their positive, valuable aspect. Though you can't see it necessarily. You don't consciously realize it. But when you look back, then you get an inkling of how your life is even always working in the best possible way. Though sometimes it may seem to be negative. All right. I hope that's clear. Is it? Great. So then, going to the matter of goodness and evil, or love and hate, you could say. The authors discuss the evolution of human beings. Is it an evolutionary tendency which will gradually, as the centuries and the years pass, uplift the hearts of people to a more purer state? Like climbing a ladder. But even there, you see, as Sensei points out, love is such a dangerous word in a way. It has so many different meanings, doesn't it? And equally, as well as having all those different meanings, love can very, very, very easily turn into hate. But this is the great problem. Love actually, therefore, is an emotion. And emotions can change in a flash. And emotions can sometimes be strong and other times be very weak. That is the nature of emotion, isn't it? So love is not an easy word to use because there are so many different ways of viewing it. And as pointed out, people have done terrible things for the sake of love. A man will kill sometimes for the sake of love, and so will a woman. So that, of course, is emphasizing the fact that love has this dangerous, possessive side to it, as well as love in a compassionate sense. The two are there, aren't they? Two sides of a coin. Therefore, they're a part of life. For the sake of the love of Jesus, the Jesuits established what was called the Inquisition and carried out the most repulsive tortures in order to try to get people to recant from their mistaken beliefs. For the sake of the love of Jesus, people were burnt at the stake because they believed that they were following erroneous teachings. Incredible, isn't it, really, what man can go towards? Or even in more recent times, Buddhist priests, you remember in Vietnam, burnt themselves to death by pouring petrol over themselves. This was for the sake of their concern for humanity. And of course, in modern times, we see all sorts of distortions of the word love. People who happen to love animals hurting human beings, and vice versa, and so on and so on. There are so many examples. So love is a trap in a sense. And people use the word ever since the 60s, I suppose, more than any other time, perhaps in history. People have used this word love as if it's the solution to everything. People still do use it. But love is a vague word in itself, isn't it? Perhaps it's interesting in that sense that God is vague too. People say God is love. What is love and what is God? So altogether, it's very indistinct and therefore not a guide to being a great human being. So even now, good and evil, of course, can be seen not just in the actions of a human being, but in the collective actions of a lot of human beings, or in the collective or in the action of one human being for the sake of all human beings. So I was absolutely staggered to hear the other day, as you know, over the years, there have been an incredible number of reports of UFOs, especially in the United States, not so much in Europe. Huge numbers, thousands and thousands of such reports. But what I read the other day, and I'm sure it was correct, is that the instructions to the United Nations, to the United States Air Force, are without question, without advice even, to attack. If actually a UFO materializes beyond just being a report from some person or a very, very distant object. That's incredible, isn't it? But that is how it stands at this present time, apparently. Automatically attack. Don't wait to discover what it is. Don't wait to discover what sort of beings there are inside it, but attack. Incredible, isn't it? There you are. I mean, that is, of course, the opposite side of love, and a good example of the inherent tendency of evil working in human life. Evil on whoever was permitted to actually make such a regulation. So, of course, gradually Toynbee is discovering through all these interesting things they're discussing that there can be no other thing that one should revere or worship or devote yourself to but life itself. It seems so commonsensical, doesn't it? When you say that, it's hardly believable that human beings haven't known what to worship in the past. It's so simple and so obvious, yet it has escaped men of great wisdom over the centuries. That life itself is what we should worship. And of course, through making life the object of worship, we also tend to be propelled towards helping other people who are suffering. And we discover, incredible joy and satisfaction and fulfillment that arises from the act of helping someone else overcome their sufferings. So many of us probably discover this for the first time. Of course, there are some people in whom the world of Bodhisattva is very strong. People who become nurses or doctors. It's there, anyway, very strongly. But the vast majority of human beings are not nurses or doctors. Sometimes it's very difficult to bring yourself, to get out of yourself, as it were, and go outwards to someone else. And the supreme act for that is, of course, shakabuku, isn't it? We'll discuss that a little bit in a moment. So Toynbee says at the beginning of this section, my conclusion is that life is paradoxical, awkward, difficult, and painful. But this probably is what a lot of people think. Toynbee had many difficulties, many tragedies, too, in his life. With his son committing suicide and so on. He probably felt, that it was so painful. But it was all the more meaningful, of course, when Sensei, through his explanation, began to make it clear to him what was throwing life off balance. And the reason is A, the vital importance of an object of worship, and B, the correctness of that object of worship. And the object of worship can be or should be nothing else but life itself. So let's go on for a bit now and look at the Buddhist view of love in relation to what Buddhism promotes, which is jihi, or compassion. The Buddha's compassion, or Buddhist compassion. Jihi. I've already talked about the ambiguity of the word love, because love actually has its two sides to it, like everything else, negative and positive. So either it can be a desire to help someone else to overcome their pain or their suffering, but on the other side of it, it can be so incredibly possessive, a love which is actually desiring to possess or influence or dominate another person. Love which is totally selfish, in other words. So in the world as it stands at the moment, Toynbee considers that love has this word love has sort of become institutionalized. We institutionalize love, perhaps because we're so bad at expressing altruistic love or compassion to people off our own bat, talking generally about people in the world. So we have institutions that look after old people, whereas 200 years ago, families looked upon it as quite natural to look after their old people, and they arranged their lives so that it was possible. Or we institutionalize, even these days, the love of small children, because mothers, so many of them, go out to work and in the process get absorbed often, not always, of course, but often get absorbed with their affairs outside of the home, and the babies get neglected. The little children get neglected. So many ways this word love can be distorted. And it is true that we have institutionalized love because people in this hectic world find it so difficult to sustain it. So we have welfare systems and all the rest of it to replace what was originally an individual matter. And then Toynbee mentions that the word charity in Latin is caritas. And caritas means belovedness. So he's still, at this point in the book, still hanging on to this matter of love, because Sensei hasn't yet explained any alternative to it. So today, they agree charity has been maligned hugely. Perhaps it always has been. Perhaps charity has always been an act carried out by people, or by a lot of people, in order to feel good for their own, in fact, their own self-satisfaction, or to overcome their own feelings of guilt. Of course, not everybody. Some people who act or do things or give money for charity do it with the purest of motives. And many, many people also do it for what are in fact negative motives. And of course, if charity is given in that way, even though it may not be obvious on the surface of life, then those who receive the charity will act negatively towards it too. So we all know how charity, in dealing with the problems of Africa, has often seen the money being used in the wrong way, or being stacked away by ministers and statesmen of the state. That is the pitfall in charity. Charity can be very demeaning to those who receive, can't it? To live on charity is perhaps a very low and demeaning thing to do. Old ladies often don't like charity, do they? Because they lose their dignity through charity. So I'm sure probably your mothers or your grandmothers, or you've seen some example in your families of old people who are fiercely independent. The last thing on earth they do would to live on other people's money. And even from the point of view of physical health, they'll wait till they're, literally on their last legs, in the full meaning of the word, before they will accept such help. If human beings want it, they like to keep their dignity as a human being. So here again, love and charity all have such weak aspects to them. And yet they are the things that people are always talking about in most parts of the world. So charity is not bad, of course not. But in its action, it presents many, many very delicate problems. And though the greatest of all being the attitude or the feeling of the people who are receiving it. So charity, from the Buddhist point of view, is important at times as, for example, a rescue operation in a desperate state of emergency. Then giving in the form of charity is necessary and is important. If, for example, a particularly important research unit into some disease like cancer is having to close because it hasn't got enough money, of course it's very important action for human beings to give money to save that. But on its own, charity isn't enough. That's the whole point, isn't it? Because charity gives short-term happiness where human beings are concerned. It doesn't give lasting happiness. It doesn't, in other words, help the other human being to change their karma. So you can give charity with your whole heart to somebody, but unless their karma changes, they're still going to suffer. This, of course, one understands in the light of Buddhism, but it's people beyond and outside of Buddhism find that difficult to understand. Probably it doesn't even enter their heads. But this is the truth of it, isn't it? You can give your whole possessions to somebody. Or you can spend a whole lifetime or part of a lifetime looking after somebody else. But unless that somebody else changes their karma, they can never actually be truly happy, whatever wonderful and beautiful actions the other person is making towards them. Therefore, jihi is so much more important because it implies not only relieving sufferings, but giving lasting happiness. In other words, of course, through shakabuku. So we have a little break, and then we'll go on with a more detailed examination of jihi. Okay, so far, everybody? Good. All right, fine. Enjoy it. Talk about jihi in a little more detail. So the Japanese define jihi, as you probably read, those of you who had time to read this particular section. Can you hear? Sorry. Is that better? What's happening, Mark? Okay, that's all right. Right. The Japanese define jihi, as Sensei explains in this section, by the words baku yoraku. Baku yoraku. Baku, B-A-K-K-U. It's in the book, actually. Yoraku, Y-O-R-A-K-U. Baku means removing sorrow or suffering. And yoraku means giving joy. Removing sorrow or suffering and giving joy. So, of course, removing suffering means what it implies. That means totally removing. So, to totally remove suffering means you've got to get at the fundamental cause of it, haven't you, in Buddhist terms, which is hidden deep in people's lives. In other words, it means they actually are able, through what you do for them, to change their karma. So the whole aim, of course, of any of you, if you want to help someone who's suffering, is, for goodness sake, to get them to chant Nam-myoho-renge-kyo. Whether they are able to or not is a different matter. That depends on the depths of their karma, on their nature and character. But you do your best. So that is real compassion. The Buddha's compassion, not only to relieve the suffering, but to totally relieve it and give joy in its place. So to do that, inherent in that word baku, removing suffering, is the ability to feel the suffering of that person so much that every word you say is meaningful to them. If you spoke to them without feeling their suffering in your life, your words would probably be empty. They wouldn't hit the heart of the other person. But because you can totally feel their suffering and their pain, what you say comes from your heart and penetrates their heart through however thick a karma there may be, around that heart. So the task of the bodhisattva, therefore, is often stated as to draw out evil and give joy. It's another way of defining jihi, to draw out evil and give joy. In other words, through feeling their suffering, and at the same time, through your total desire to give them lasting happiness through chanting Nam-myoho-renge-kyo, what will come from your life will draw out that evil. Or to put it another way, it means that you can put out both your hands, if you like, and pull them out of the pit of hell without falling in yourself. So that is the great bodhisattva act, isn't it, of Shakabuku?